Yes, right in the middle there with the cream jumper.
Okay, does it work? Sure. Okay, I have a question for Elizabeth. That was a very interesting talk. And I wondered if you ever asked the consumers how they feel about captive bred bears and wild bears, if they have a preference at all.
Yeah, I asked that question in Laos. I'm trying to think back to Cambodia. I believe I did, and I think they overwhelmingly all said wild, which we've also seen in our quantitative questionnaires. Yeah.
Great, thank you. In the second row here with the gray.
This question is for Stephen and Joss. So Stephen, I noticed on your partnership slide, you listed Alibaba. If you could share a little bit about that nature of that partnership. And then in relation, Joss, in terms of who is cooperating with API access versus scraping, and the nature of scraping, if it's old data or recent data. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't know.
We'll just talk. So Alibaba, yeah, Traffic has a cooperation agreement with Alibaba, and we particularly been working with their security department to look at how they screen for keywords. They've made a corporate commitment to keep certain illegal wildlife products off their platforms. And so we work with them in terms of how they do that screening, and things like saying about changing search terms. So we're monitoring what the chat is in different areas of wildlife trade and seeing what new terms, like ivory becomes white plastic or something like this, and how you start advising those so they can adjust the terms. So we work with them on that, but also looking how the platform can be used in terms of potential behavior change messaging. So, for example, I don't know if you've been shopping at the weekend online, but anything you look at, if you look at, I don't know, glasses, and you don't buy any, then for the rest of this week, you're going to see adverts on Facebook or everywhere offering you glasses, even though you never actually purchased any. Well, any provider like Alibaba can see what you've been searching for. So if someone's been searching for ivory, then you have a market who you could start directing messaging at. So also looking not just at the security side, but also some of the behavioral change opportunities around that. But it's a big company, it takes time to work. But the security department, I think last time I checked with our team in China, there were more people looking for wildlife products in Alibaba's security department than we had working for traffic in China. So they are taking it seriously.
Yeah, and from my perspective, building these relationships takes a long time, and I wouldn't say that I'm very far in that process yet. The first line of inquiry that I've usually taken has been to see what we can get externally, because if you can get it yourself, you don't have to rely on the internals. And obviously, not as was just said, these things, there's a lot of inertia, and they also have particular goals themselves. So they will often be interested in preventing a trade, so they'll take that down, but not necessarily in providing you with the statistics of how much is going on at a particular moment. And so, I should say that there was discussion of qualitative and quantitative methods in interview. There's a revolutionary idea going on in computer science at the moment that you can actually talk to people, which is quite a culture shift for us. And so we're working on it, but if we can program it, we prefer it that way. So.
Great. Next question, I think Elizabeth in the blue.
Thanks very much. My question is for Joss, to talk a little bit more about this whole trust issue, because the wildlife trafficking we know is absolutely notorious for fakes, and you probably don't buy any one product very often. So how do you start to build up that trust on the net? I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, so I think this is something that has fascinated me, and I only came across this quite recently because my experience of looking at sort of illicit online trade has largely been through much more Western focused, which is where the drug trade tends to be focused, and particularly these very technologically advanced darknet market trades. And the natural reaction there seems to have been to build in very strong trust mechanisms. So on the Silk Road, for example, every seller had a feedback rating, and if you had a lower feedback rating than about 4.7 stars out of 5, nobody would trade with you. And my assumption when I first went into this is that every marketplace that was illicit would build in a mechanism like this. And I was quite shocked to see some of the websites I've found, some of the forums I've seen on WeChat. There really does seem to be very little feedback mechanism in that sense. There's very little trust. The only thing I've seen is, to some extent, to smear a particular seller who is known for not engaging in trade correctly. But my genuine answer there is I really don't know. I know how I would build trust into a system, and I know how all my friends who build these systems build it. I really don't have a good understanding of how trust is built online in places where there isn't a mechanism like that. But it certainly seems to be the case that people are using it, and it's being effective to some extent. Maybe it's just accepted that there's a certain amount of fraud and fake trades going on. I really can't answer that.
And Steve, did you also want
Yeah,
to?
just wanted to say there's so what we've experienced in a number of markets for some products has been moved much more away from e-commerce platforms into social media platforms, so that you've got closed group discussions on different company platforms. And so one trust thing is how do people gain entry or stay in those groups? And obviously, what we can see with ivory trade groups, for example, in China is they're participants. They share ideas and thoughts about the different products that are being discussed. They're seen to buy things. You can see who's bought what, and so obviously, if you're from a research or investigation point of view, you're infiltrating those groups. You've got to somehow stay in there. You've got to gain entry, which sometimes has been actually through physical market locations. They've been advertising the groups. So if you can get in there, you've met someone at the shop, you can infiltrate the group. But then, of course, you've got to try and stay in there. And clearly, trust doesn't work entirely because NGOs manage to sit and monitoring that, researchers monitoring some of these groups. But there's certainly been a lot more emphasis on that, I'd say, rather than the e-commerce platforms in returns. But I would say, when it comes to reporting, this is a thing we always try to put a caveat with traffic research in this, is that offers on the internet, they're not always real. So you can see, there's 100 adverts for ivory this week. Well, how many of them were real? Well, how many even were people who thought, I can probably sell the stuff that other guy's advertising if I can get a bit of a... so you have to be really careful with what some of the meaning of the truth is with internet sales.
I just want to add one point, because I think it's not necessarily sort of directly answering the question, but I think it's an important point between the e-commerce and the social media, is what I see a lot more happening is you get general purpose platforms. WeChat, you could call a social media site, but it sort of organically allows within it sort of e-commerce to happen. And the same is true for VK in Russia. And to some extent Facebook, which you get as the basis of some small business platforms now. And this isn't just for illicit trading, this is for all trading. And so I think in some senses, these different models of, do you have a dedicated e-commerce platform that does everything very officially and is in some sense is quite restrictive? Or do you have this sort of much more organic growth of a community that will buy and sell and trade? Is a very interesting question to look into.
I think I'll just interject here, just to bring in on this topic of trust. I wonder whether Liz would also be able to expand on how you worked to gain trust in the communities that you were working in Cambodia and Laos PDR in order to really get honesty within the responses and how you went about that.
I think I just never judged them for what they were purchasing, what they told me. I always acted interested and wanted to know more, and I never was hand slapping them or anything like that, which I have seen. So I actually had one interpreter who would tell them off if they were, so I got rid of him because I wanted them to feel comfortable with talking about it. It's just that.
All right, thank you. Any other questions? I'll take One from the back, I think you had your hand up.
Hi, it was actually for Liz, but you almost answered it in your last response. It was actually about language and having an interpreter, and how did you overcome, because obviously it's about that free discussion, and how did you overcome that? And also, did you from an ethical sense, did you say where you're from and what your study was? Just that whole trusting, but you've started to cover it already.
Yeah, so I had oral consent forms, and it was long and rambling, and often they were just like, yeah, whatever, it's fine, I don't care, I'll just talk to you. And I told them I was from the University of Bristol. I didn't want to tell them I was from a zoo, because obviously that would skew responses. And you asked about interpreters, so yeah, my interpreters were wonderful in Cambodia and in Laos. And this is something I meant to talk about in that, but I think it was really important that they were women, because myself as a woman and them as women, I think we got a lot more responses from women than we would have if we were men. Because I found bear parts, bear bile mixed in wine is used for postpartum, and obviously that can be a little bit touchy for people. So it was really nice actually that they were so open in talking about that with me. And yeah, with getting a discussion going, that was really, I had to have very good interpreters to have that kind of discussion. I struggled a little bit in Lao because, as I said with the Chinese, I kept asking about Chinese influence, and my interpreter thought that was stupid, so she kept trying to not ask those questions, and she was like, yeah, they don't hang out with Chinese people. So I had to be like, no, you need to ask. And it's great, because you do get a good relationship with your interpreter as well, and I got a lot of information that way, too. Was that, did you have anything else that you're, no, okay.
Right. This gentleman in the front.
Steve, it's a question for you. One of your slides was all about partnerships, and I was struck by the sheer volume of organisations there. I've really got a question. What is the emerging structure and process for those partnerships to reach down to the many organisations represented here in terms of sharing information on the IWT?
Yeah, some things working well and some things not. So there's all sorts of parts of it. There are partnerships between intergovernmental organisations. For example, there's one called IQIC, the International Consortium for Combating Wildlife Crime, which involves UNODC, World Customs Organization, World Bank, CITES, etc. They're very much about cooperation between those organisations. It's not particularly open. They go to conferences and have a workshop like this, and that's an opportunity, but it's not. It's mostly about collaboration between those organisations. That's the purpose. I've asked them a number of times, wouldn't it be good to invite more people in and have some open sessions, and apparently it's in the works at some point. But there are others. I mean, I mentioned this, the community of practice on consumer behaviour change in this field, and that's deliberately been set up as a community. So we're facilitating it, but then anyone can join it and engage with it, and it's online and it's very interactive. And I think they just vary a lot. Obviously, some organisations are publishing a lot, so there's a lot of access to information through that. But yeah, it's this, as you noted, and the point of that slide is it's just become a very busy space. It's in some ways a success of getting attention to this issue after many years of not getting attention to it. But I think there's a lot to work out in the community of practice in the whole area of illegal wildlife trade to get better venues for cooperation, sharing research. Beyond that behaviour change world, there isn't basic sort of market trends, things like that. There aren't really good platforms for sharing research and information. In terms of some of the actions and learning, like what sort of training works, what's capacity building. Capacity building is a great example of where I don't think this is working very well. Many NGOs and governments running training for enforcers or judiciary or working with the private sector around the world, that probably teaching the same ideas, same things with completely different materials, and So I think a lot can be done to improve, but although the issue isn't a new issue, a lot of the sort of engagement of more organisations is quite recent. So I think it's maturing slowly.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. There's one here, and then if the other mic can go to the, yes. Just right this second.
Thank you. I have 2 questions for Josh. Number 1 is, happens that we monitor online, especially the online trade, more on Borneo sites, and then it's actually not involved on animal product, but it's live pet trade. Okay, so in terms of monitoring online, is there any method that we do not double count the number of the wildlife being traded? Yeah, because we frequently found that in whatever they advertise in one platform, it could be re-advertised in another platform. How we elicit and taken out this double advertisement and count as 2. And my question number 2 is there any mechanisms that or any other method that besides then shut down the trade, the online trade, that we can go for other investigations to assist the law enforcement agencies? Because currently what we do is we shut down and report and shut down the trade site. But we found out that it's much more difficult for us when everything go underground. So is there other methods that you guys are looking into it? Thank you.
Great.
So I apologize, I'm not 100% sure that I quite got both questions, but I'll answer what I think the question was. So the first one was about counting when sort of there's multiple products, maybe that you see one advertisement and there's sort of multiple products there being sold. I mean, a lot of these answers are always going to depend on the platform themselves, because if you can see the actual trades, if you can see the number being traded, then that's something. So sometimes, for example, on eBay, you will see one advert for one product, then it will say 300 available or 200 available. And one of the things that we've done on other marketplaces is we just basically keep watching that page to see how the numbers tick down, to see how many are available for something like that. For other trades where you can see some evidence of the transactions taking place, you can just monitor the number of transactions. And then sometimes you want to effectively triangulate. You can say, there are a number of sellers who are offering products for sale, a number of buyers who you can see are leaving feedback for sales. And you can sometimes sort of work out through a combination of data sources what actual trades were going on. So there are a variety of methods beyond just counting adverts for products. But again, it depends on the access you have to the platform. The second question about takedown when things get driven to other places, it's an endless problem and a very tricky problem. But by and large, so for example, 2 of the major darknet marketplaces for drug sales have just been taken down. And a large volume of the trade has shifted to another marketplace that is slightly harder to access. But ultimately the question is, what is your goal? If your goal is to study something and get a sort of overview of where stuff is going on and what trading is going on, then you don't want to be interfering too much with that. But ultimately, if you're trying to stop a trade, then you're going to eventually drive people to the other places where it can carry on. Certainly, I think that taking down platforms is quite problematic, as opposed to focusing on either, like I say, reducing demand for the products is something that we work on as at the heart of this project, but also sort of focusing on buyers and sellers to try and stop it there. And of course, enforcement from the platform and agreement with platforms.
Steve, did you also?
Just say, on the first part, really assessing volumes of trade from the retail end is really difficult, even with a shop, never mind online. But you can see what's there that day. You can maybe see some change. You can pick up a bit of information there locally, but mostly you see occurrence. You don't really see how much is turning over. There are some methods to do that. including some of the innovations with technology now. You can even CCTV the place, and you can see transactions taking place. It's difficult online, but there are some methods. eBay, as you say, with transaction history, you can get some information. So, but it is a constant quest to work out how to get turnover and volume information. On the second point, is really interesting actually. So there's a business session tomorrow working with business. I think it'd be a really good place to look at, to raise this issue if you can go to that. I was meeting with colleagues with some banks last week talking about what banks can do to stop illegal wildlife trade, and same with transport or internet companies. The first thing they do is they say, well, we're making a commitment to not allow it on our platform. So as a matter of principle, they've committed to say if they're told about something, they're going to stop it. And then the second thing is if they allow something to continue, either because a research or an enforcement agency wants to watch it, then their lawyers say, now we're liable because we're allowing it to happen. So their clear message is if an enforcement agency tells us to keep it going, then we might keep it going if our lawyers are happy, while you finish the job as soon as possible because we've made a commitment. So I think that connection between the law enforcement agency and the company is absolutely critical. So someone asked about the Alibaba example. They're working now very closely with law enforcement, more closely than in the past with law enforcement in China on these sorts of issues. How maybe you should keep a sales avenue open for a certain amount of time to learn more, learn where the money's coming, where a product's coming and going, and then close it down. But from a company perspective, when you've pledged to stop something, and your lawyers are telling you we need to stop anything you see, it's difficult. So it really needs that impetus from law enforcement as well.
We'll have our last question, and we'll have to be quick on our answer because the coffee is waiting. So.
Oh, that's an incentive. I'm Tanya McRae still, and I work for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and I work on wildlife cybercrime, so I look forward to catching up with Steve and Josh in the break. But as time is of the essence, my question is for Liz. I was just wondering how much your involvement as a researcher biases the results, and how do you address that? So, do you find that different people respond to you because you're female, because of your ethnicity? And is there a way that you have to capture and communicate that? Or is it an issue that you've seen? Or is it something that you can counter in any way?
It's definitely variable. So I actually did conduct a lot of interviews in English in Cambodia with the higher status males. And I felt they were trying to show off to me sometimes for being, foreign and female. In Laos, they often hardly seemed to notice I was there because I was just sitting there like a lemon, so I wasn't that interesting. In Cambodia, I think they thought I was quite interesting, but I think they just think of me as very eccentric. And so they're happy to talk about bear part use because they're like, well, this weird lady wants to know. Is kind of my impression from my work. Who knows, I could be missing all sorts of things. But the sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? The fact that they were so kind of open in both places makes me think that I wasn't really having an effect necessarily, so.
Well, it's my task then to thank the panelists and to thank each of you for engaging in the question and answer. We could give the panelists one more round of applause.